Before I start, I'd just like to note that this is why I make videos to you and not to people like EvoGen. Not because I'm some stealth egalitarian with a super amount of bias, but rather, you keep whining about me, and I sometimes feel like I want to address it.
Alright, first off, right out of the bag, we have a bogus claim. SofiaRune, you started making videos to me first. And day in, day out, we see your comments, and your comments never involve chiding the anti-heretic or EvoGen. In fact, you post favorable comments on Hannibal the Dingus, of all people. And you never posted a comment attacking EvoGen's environmental determinism, as far as I know. You certainly never made a video on it. And your comments are generally directed against me. And also, you started this kerfuffle between you and me. Moreover, you post comments directed against the race realists in general who haven't had the level of interaction with you that I have had, right? But you don't post comments attacking racial egalitarians in general, even though they hold just as extreme positions, right? They're just as close to the environmental determinist side of the scale as the race realists are to the genetic determinist side of the scale, yet you only see fit to really attack the quote-unquote race realists. And so your explanation that this is a personal thing and not an ideological thing doesn't explain that, okay? The ideological explanation explains your behavior much better. I'm not accusing you of being a stealth egalitarian, okay? Because you have all the stealth of a little kid running around in a blanket who thinks he's invisible. But you did get me on one point. I did get your credentials wrong, and on that point you are right, and I was unequivocally wrong.
Alright. Anyway, so the biggest issue here, once again, for instance, you don't know that a heritability estimate and a heritability, like the actual true heritability, aren't the same thing.
Okay, so I don't know that an estimate of how many beans are in a jar is not the same as how many beans are actually in the jar? That's amazing. See, I always thought that whenever anybody made an estimate, that it was always true.
Of course you can make heritability estimates without the genes. These procedures were, invented before we knew what genes were. I was saying that you can't really do that properly for intelligence because that is a trait that does not lend itself very well to traditional pedigree estimates.
Alright, well, before she continues, the heritability of IQ within the United States is about 0.7 according to the American Psychological Association, whereas height is generally considered to be about 0.8 heritable.
Yes, some traits, the way we do this, the way people who actually know what they're doing do this, is if they're going to estimate the heritability, or they're going to estimate exactly what type of heritability this trait they're looking at has, they can look at pedigrees and see if they line up with our known segregation of genes and how those work. So we can tell if something's dominant or recessive, or if it's X-linked or not. We can actually look at a pedigree and make an inference that's reasonable based on who is affected in this pedigree with whatever trait we're looking at.
That has nothing to do with estimating the heritability of IQ from the results of twin studies.
So you can't look at pedigrees in that way. Now, people have tried to use monozygotic and dizygotic twin studies, and while that can work for some traits, it certainly doesn't work for most of them, because a lot of these traits are a lot more complicated than we thought they were.
Okay, top-down heritability estimates collapse all that complexity, though. Right, and so you're saying, well, these top-down heritability estimates get knocked down because the trait is more complicated than we initially thought. Well, if you're talking about complications at the gene interaction level, so what? That doesn't mean squat for top-down heritability estimates. If you're talking about complexity in terms of environmental effects, then yeah, that'll affect the top-down heritability estimates, but it affects the bottom-up heritability estimates just as much. So what you're saying here is kind of a non sequitur.
And our assumptions about the heritability of these traits are currently being knocked down one after another. Now, there's a paper I'm going to link below that talks about why top-down estimates can be substantially higher than the actual true narrow sense heritability. And that sometimes this missing heritability issue, this gap between top-down and bottom-up estimates, is because that heritability actually isn't there. It's that we have overestimated the heritability in monozygotic and dizygotic twin studies. And that's just the nature of those models. Like, these traditional methods don't work on intelligence because there are multiple assumption violations, like additivity. Okay, the paper's down there. I know none of you are going to read it. Even if I sent it to you, none of you are going to read it, but that's fine. I don't really care. We can't use these top-down estimates because they do not yield accurate heritability estimates.
Okay, well, let's look at the heritability of height. There's a great missing heritability there between top-down and bottom-up estimates, as I guess I'll call them. It's a decent lexicon. So, do you know the missing heritability in height? Do you know that that is due to the heritability just not being there? That the real heritability of height is really only about 0.4 or 0.3, depending on who you're talking to? If not, well, then why do you think that way about IQ? Or are you just agnostic on both issues? Right? We don't know if IQ is really about 0.7. We don't know if height is 0.8 heritability. Right? We just don't know. In the US, I'm talking about here, for clarification. And if you really know the answer to the problem of missing heritability, being that the heritability just isn't there, well, you should be working on that paper and preparing for your Nobel acceptance speech.
They do not deal with the confounding variables. They don't control for them. They don't. And so you can read about that if you want, but you won't, and that's fine.
Confounding variables like womb environment, stereotype threat, twin adoptions not running the full gamut of potential environmental differences. Are you saying that researchers don't try to control for these things? Or, I mean, I agree, confounders exist. So what? So no predictions allowed? Or therefore all top-down estimates are wrong? Or what are you even saying? What's the punchline here? You don't give a punchline. This is stupid.
So I think it's really weird that you act as if I'm against genome-wide association studies.
No.
And you bring up the Davies et al. Paper.
Who are you arguing with? In the video you're responding to, I made no mention of the study that you're talking about.
Even though when I talked to you for 3 hours, sometime after trying to tell you what recombination was, we went over that paper. And I told you I actually liked that paper and thought it was a step in the right direction, even though they didn't manage to validate their model because it didn't predict IQ in an independent sample.
What do you mean it doesn't predict? Okay, a 0.7 general heritability doesn't predict anything? If we look at mixed race populations, they have intermediate IQs of the races that they are composed of whenever these populations are looked at. Now, yeah, everyone's a snowflake, but when you look at mixed race populations, they tend to have IQs intermediate between the populations that they are composed of. Now you can say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean ... Well, and fine, it doesn't necessarily mean genetics, all right? But it is a prediction, right? And you're saying that these top-down estimates can't predict when they do. Correlation in IQ between parent and child living apart, 0.22. Now, based on that single data point, we would assume a general heritability at that age of 0.44, which I believe, based on this thing that I'm looking at, I think it was at age 9. But of course, we should keep in mind that the heritability of IQ increases with age, giving us general heritability estimates that are higher by adulthood. Okay? Top-down estimates predict very well. This is just wrong. Egalitarians spend most of their time explaining this predictive power as being some sort of genetic illusion, right? With gene-environment interaction, epigenetic effects, and old-fashioned social forces being so strong and intergenerational that they make it look as if the IQ differences are down to genetic differences. Okay, so you're just out of the mainstream, or by being able to predict things, or by having predictive powers, you're referring to something else.
And so this is the whole thing. You have no predictive power. And without that predictive power, you can't really say whether or not your heritability estimate means shit. So until you can get there, we're stuck with, I don't fucking know, we better wait until we have more information. But you guys aren't willing to do that because you don't understand what you don't know and are willing to be like, oh, well, you know, these pre fucking human genome project projections of heritability must be right because I don't know why, but they must be. They somehow magically account for all of these confounding variables that bias heritability estimates.
Yeah, again, if by confounder you mean an environmental confounder, well, bottom-up heritability estimates face all those same problems too. So it's not a specific charge against top-down estimates. And if by genetic confounder, like other candidate genes having the effect than what you think it might be causing it, well, that's a confounder that top-down heritability estimates don't face. So I don't know what you could possibly be going on about here. Sophia concludes by spitting off a bunch of jargon that I don't understand and the audience doesn't understand, and so it's done for the sole purpose of gaslighting, and then claims that I don't know half of what I think I know. Right? It's just jargon and the trappings of authority. To summarize what's going on, Sophia is rejecting top-down heritability estimates, but at least, unlike the skeptical heretic, she understands that bottom-up estimates are also, drumroll please, estimates. And she's also saying that these top-down heritability estimates have no predictive power when they do. Maybe she's referring to predictive power in some other sense, but in terms of predicting what IQs people are going to have based on the IQs of their relatives, even if they're in a different environment, and the correspondence between family IQ and their IQ increasing with age, and how both the heritability and magnitude of the racial IQ gaps widens with age, right? Hereditarians predict all this stuff. It all fits into the hereditarian fold, right? All I can think is that she's talking about predictive power in some other sense. And then she goes on about confounders. Sure, confounders. Everything has confounders. If you just abdicated prediction at the mere existence of confounders, well, then you'd never predict anything and you'd be retardedly skeptical.